Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a curious little corner of history, how medieval kings kept their cool, literally. Picture it, a regal castle, stone walls thick with centuries of secrets, the air heavy with heat, and yet, in the midst of summer's oppressive swelter, the king somehow stays unflustered. How? Well, it turns out that medieval royalty had a very cool secret. Ice. Yes, that same ice you're probably picturing in your drink right now. Well, maybe not that exact ice, but you get the idea. You probably won't survive this without a bit of imagination, though. Imagine enduring a life where no one even thought of air conditioning, let alone frozen smoothies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time. Let's see how far our journey takes us tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now let's begin with something as simple as it is strange. Medieval kings and their rather peculiar obsession with ice. You see, these royals weren't just interested in keeping their drinks cold, though that was part of it. They were in search of something far deeper. In an age where comfort was a luxury, ice served as both a literal and symbolic tool for the kings to maintain their power, stay calm under pressure, and even influence their health. Imagine being in the middle of a political crisis, with enemies closing in on every side, and the heat of the moment and the heat of the day threatening to overwhelm you. What do? You send for ice. Yes, they would send trusted men out to fetch ice from distant frozen lakes, a process that might take days. Once it arrived, it would be stored in ice houses, hidden deep underground to keep the chill intact for as long as possible. And in moments of high stress, the king could retreat to his chambers. Ice around him, and the world outside would feel a little less heated. Ice became his mental shield. It wasn't just about comfort. The psychological impact of the coolness could help settle a racing mind, especially in an environment where decisions could mean life or death. Kings didn't have the luxury of popping down to their local spa or enjoying a cool breeze from an open window. Their world was one of constant tension, and staying composed was a matter of life, or more likely death, on the battlefield or in the court. Historians still argue whether ice was more about physical comfort or psychological influence. Was it an early form of what we might call stress management today? Or was it purely for its cooling effects on the body? Whatever the case, kings knew how to use ice to their advantage, even though they didn't have the benefit of modern science telling them exactly why it worked. You're settling into the night now, aren't you? Picture it once more. The soft crackle of a fire in a stone hearth, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the corridors of the castle, and a cool breeze drifting through narrow windows. Except this breeze isn't exactly natural. It's coming from something much rarer, much more precious. Ice. But how did this cold commodity find its way into the royal chambers? Let's take a closer look at the royal relationship with ice, which, believe it or not, went beyond just the practical act of keeping cool. The kings of medieval Europe didn't just grab ice from the nearest lake whenever the temperature soared. No, acquiring ice was a business, a luxury. The royals had entire systems in place to harvest it, store it, and make sure it lasted through scorching summer months. It wasn't the kind of thing you could just pick up at the market. No, this required a real commitment. A king would send men to gather ice from frozen lakes or rivers in the winter, usually in northern territories where the cold was reliably severe. Once harvested, the ice was stored in specially constructed ice houses, deep insulated pits designed to keep the ice frozen for as long as possible. It sounds like quite the logistical feat, right? And it was. The ice houses, though humble by modern standards, were marvels of medieval engineering. These structures were built with thick walls made of earth and wood, designed to keep the ice from melting even as the outside temperatures soared. Some ice houses had layers of straw, sawdust, or even peat to provide additional insulation. Imagine that, an underground fortress for ice, built with all the care you'd put into preserving something truly valuable. And yet, the effort didn't stop with just bringing the ice to the castle. Ice needed to be handled carefully. Too much exposure to the air could cause it to melt, and even the best insulation couldn't protect it forever. This meant that ice was typically rationed. It was carefully doled out to royal courts, sometimes in tiny quantities, making it a precious commodity. This scarcity only added to its prestige. Ice wasn't just useful, it was a statement of wealth. The more ice you had, the more you could show off. Some historians argue that the use of ice in royal palaces was as much a social tool as a physical one. By displaying such rare luxury, kings could subtly remind their subjects and rivals alike that they were untouchable, living a life that mere mortals could scarcely imagine. And it wasn't only about cooling off on a hot day. Ice was used in various ways, not just to keep cool during summer months, but as a form of ceremonial luxury. Kings used ice to impress guests at feasts, offering cold drinks, ice cream, and sometimes even desserts chilled in ice, adding an air of sophistication to the event. Ice was an elegant addition to banquets, turning a simple gathering into an affair of royal splendor. As the use of ice expanded beyond the courts, the ice trade itself grew, an international business supplying the rich and powerful across Europe. Historians still argue whether the ice trade played a larger role in the development of modern refrigeration techniques, or if it was simply a passing phase of medieval opulence. But one thing's certain, ice was one of the early luxuries that distinguished royalty from the common folk. While peasants sweated through their days with no reprieve from the heat, kings had a constant flow of coolness at their fingertips. Just one of the many ways medieval kings used ice to maintain an image of grandeur. The process of acquiring and managing ice was nothing short of a royal endeavor, one that required resources, organization, and a hefty amount of money. Imagine for a moment that you're a member of the royal court, the faint chill from the nearby ice house wafting through the hallways. The king is about to enter the great banquet hall, where a feast will soon be served and the ice from the faraway lakes will soon be displayed in all its frosty glory, reserved for the most elite members of the court. How's that for a little taste of medieval luxury? As you settle deeper into the narrative, imagine being in the midst of a grand banquet, the air thick with the chatter of courtiers, the clink of goblets, and the aromatic fumes of roasted meats. There, on a silver platter, rests something more precious than the food itself, ice. But beyond its role in making drinks cool and desserts sweeter, ice had a deeper function, one tied to royal poise, decision-making, and the delicate balancing act of leadership. For medieval kings, staying calm wasn't just a matter of personal preference, it was part of their leadership style. And what better way to stay composed than to have ice at the ready? Kings often relied on ice to help clear their minds. In times of political turbulence, warfare, or courtly intrigue, a king's ability to maintain mental clarity could make or break an empire. Picture it, the king, seated in his grand hall, surrounded by advisors, messengers bringing news of military victories or defeats. With his mind overwhelmed by decisions that could alter the fate of his kingdom, what does he do? He calls for ice. The cold, crisp chill of the ice brought an immediate sense of calm. Not only did it cool his body, but it helped steady his mind, allowing him to think more clearly. This wasn't just a medieval luxury, it was a practical tool for managing stress. Ice was used to clear the mind, to give the king a moment of respite from the pressure of ruling. Think about it. Without the luxury of modern mental health care practices, what else could a king do? A cold drink or a slice of ice placed on the forehead could provide relief from the stifling heat of both the environment and the political pressures. By cooling down both physically and mentally, the king could return to his duties with a clearer head. Historians still debate whether this practice of using ice for mental clarity was more of a personal preference or whether it was a well-established tradition among monarchs. Were kings simply relying on ice as a natural, almost instinctive way to calm down, or was it part of a structured practice in which they trained themselves to stay cool in the heat of the moment? What we do know is that ice played a subtle but significant role in helping kings remain composed during the most stressful times. But let's not get carried away with romanticizing ice too much. While it had its benefits, it wasn't exactly a universal remedy. Remember, not every king had the luxury of easy access to ice. Many had to rely on ice harvested from far-flung regions, sometimes from places as distant as Scandinavia, where frozen lakes were plentiful. The logistics of transporting ice were complicated and costly. Ice had to be carefully wrapped in insulating materials and transported by sea or land, which could take weeks. So, although ice was a prized commodity, it wasn't available at the snap of a royal finger. The king's access to ice often depended on his wealth, connections, and the resources at his disposal. It wasn't like ordering an iced latte from a cafe. It was a long, drawn-out process that only the most powerful could afford. The use of ice for physical and mental clarity is something we take for granted today, thanks to modern air conditioning and refrigeration. But back then, it was an exclusive, almost mystical resource. The ice served not only as a tool for comfort, but also as a reminder of the king's status, a symbol of his wealth, and an emblem of his ability to control not just his kingdom but his environment. Think about it. In a time when refrigeration didn't exist, ice was more than just a way to cool down a drink. It was a statement, a declaration that you had the resources and the power to bring the cold from nature's grasp into your personal sphere. For medieval kings, staying cool wasn't just about comfort. It was a carefully cultivated image, an essential part of how they projected their strength and control. And yet, despite all the benefits, ice wasn't without its challenges. The realities of acquiring and storing ice were not as seamless as we might imagine. Kings had to plan months in advance to ensure their ice reserves didn't run out during the hottest months. Sometimes, despite all the careful planning, ice would still melt faster than anticipated, leading to frustration and a somewhat less than cool situation. If the ice supply ran out too quickly, it could lead to tensions within the royal court, as courtiers and advisors might start to feel the heat. Not just from the weather, but from the king's mounting frustration. Historians still argue whether the occasional ice shortage affected royal decision-making. Did it contribute to heightened tensions, or even influence the outcome of royal conflicts? Was there ever a moment when a king's cool demeanor was compromised because of melted ice? It's hard to say, but what is clear is that ice was far from just a luxury. It was an intricate part of royal life, affecting everything from the king's physical well-being to his reputation as a steady, composed ruler. By now, you're probably getting used to the idea of ice as an essential part of medieval royal life. It wasn't just a luxury, but rather an intricate, well-planned commodity that required a surprising amount of care and attention to detail. But let's take a step back and look at how exactly ice was harvested and stored in the medieval period, an art that was as cold and calculated as the kings who used it. Picture this. It's winter, the cold biting through the air, and medieval men are out on frozen lakes, carefully cutting through thick layers of ice to transport it back to the castle. Not exactly the casual stroll in the park vibe, right? The process of harvesting ice in medieval times was a delicate operation. The ice had to be thick enough to be cut into large blocks, but not so thick that it couldn't be transported. Often, it was done in winter when the lakes were frozen solid. Once the ice was cut into blocks, they had to be hauled back to the castle, where they would be stored in ice houses. These ice houses were not your average storage buildings. These were carefully designed structures meant to keep the ice intact for months, sometimes even through the hottest summer months. The ice houses themselves were a marvel of medieval architecture. They were often built underground, taking advantage of the natural insulating properties of earth and stone. Some were lined with straw, sawdust, or even peat, materials that helped trap the cold air and keep the ice from melting too quickly. The deeper the ice house, the colder it would stay. The blocks of ice were stacked carefully within, with insulating layers between each block. Think of it like a frozen fortress, one that required careful maintenance, as any lapse could result in a ruined ice supply. Historians still debate the efficiency of these early ice houses. Were they truly effective, or were they simply a noble effort to preserve the coolest of luxuries? Regardless of the answer, what's clear is that these ice houses were an essential part of the medieval royal infrastructure. Without them, the carefully controlled environment that kings enjoyed would have melted away quite literally, leaving them sweltering in the heat of both summer and the political fires they had to put out. But even with these well-designed structures, the harvesting and storage of ice was a labor-intensive process. Ice had to be sourced from frozen lakes or rivers in regions where the winters were harsh enough to ensure a solid layer of ice. For example, in Northern Europe, ice harvesting was a major industry. But transporting the ice was where things got tricky. Ice had to be moved quickly, lest it begin to melt before it even reached its destination. So, medieval couriers, often aided by sledges or carts, would haul ice blocks across sometimes vast distances, depending on where the king's castle was located. If the ice was coming from a distant lake, this could take days or even weeks, depending on the weather and the terrain. It wasn't exactly an errand you'd send just anyone on. As the ice was being transported, it had to be kept cool in transit. Imagine how carefully it was wrapped. Thick blankets, straw, or even cloths soaked in cold water were used to cover the ice blocks and minimize the effects of the warmer air. The process of transporting ice was a bit like delivering the most delicate cargo imaginable. If the ice melted during transport, that was a huge setback, not just in terms of practical use, but in terms of prestige. The king couldn't be seen in the public eye with anything less than a cool demeanor, quite literally. Historians still argue about the extent to which this complex network of ice harvesting and transportation truly impacted the king's ability to rule. Did the effort to bring ice to the royal court become a metaphor for the lengths to which a king would go to maintain control and luxury? Was it an indication of how seriously they took their image? Perhaps it was, in a way, a reflection of the extreme lengths to which the royalty of the time went to maintain their status and composure. After all, if you had the ability to procure ice from afar, surely you had a grip on much more than just the physical world. Despite the elaborate efforts to harvest and transport ice, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Ice would sometimes melt faster than expected, especially if there were disruptions in the transport process. Once the ice house was filled, the ice had to be carefully monitored to ensure that the temperature inside remained low enough to keep the ice frozen. Even a minor error in storage could lead to disaster. Imagine waking up to find that your royal stock of ice had turned into a puddle. Not exactly the cool, calm atmosphere you'd want in your court, is it? But perhaps, in some strange way, the very effort it took to obtain ice only enhanced its value. Ice was no longer just something cold, it was something rare, something carefully controlled. And for a king, that made all the difference. In a world where survival depended on keeping a composed exterior, ice became a symbol of control, of strength. But it was also a reminder that even the most composed of kings had their own limitations. They too had to rely on the earth's elements and on the labor of others to maintain their grip on power. As you settle even deeper into this royal tale, imagine yourself at a lavish banquet in the heart of a medieval castle. The firelight flickers in the hearth, casting soft shadows on the stone walls. The smells of roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet pastries mingle in the air, but it's not just the food that catches your eye. It's the shimmering blocks of ice laid carefully on silver trays, their surfaces catching the light as they slowly begin to melt. The sight of ice, so rare and precious, creates an almost magical ambiance. But these aren't just for show. The use of ice during such events was a mark of status, an essential part of a medieval king's social armor. Ice was not just about cooling drinks. It became a tool for impressing guests, signaling that the host was not just wealthy, but powerful. When kings held banquets or large feasts, the ice was often brought out to show off just how much control they had over both nature and society. In an era where very few people outside of the elite could even dream of seeing ice, kings would serve their guests beverages chilled to perfection, something that would leave them in awe. Historians still argue whether the showmanship involved in serving ice during banquets was simply for impressing nobles, or if it had a deeper significance. Was it a reminder to the guests of the king's power, his ability to harness the environment around him, to tame the wild? Or was it a more subtle personal flex, signaling to the court that the king could not only command loyalty, but also command the elements themselves? Whatever the true intent, it certainly worked. Guests at these feasts would have marveled at the chilled drinks and frosty desserts, further solidifying the king's reputation as a man who had it all. Ice was used in many different ways during these banquets. Frozen treats, perhaps resembling a crude version of modern ice cream, were served to the elite. These icy desserts were sometimes flavored with fruits or herbs, offering a sweet reprieve from the heavy, meat-laden meals that often accompanied medieval feasts. This would have been a rare and luxurious experience, something that would not only satisfy the palate, but also serve as a conversation piece. You could almost hear the whispers. "Did you see that? Ice from the frozen north, delivered right to the king's court." But there was a darker side to this cool indulgence. The ice was a symbol of the massive resources at the king's disposal, but it also came with a hefty price tag. Getting the ice, storing it, and transporting it required vast amounts of manpower and money. It wasn't something that could be easily replaced if it melted, and it was far from a universally available luxury. While the nobility could flaunt this resource, it served as a harsh reminder that not everyone in the kingdom had the luxury of enjoying such comforts. In fact, the disparity between the ice-laden tables of the elite and the peasant's life under the harsh summer sun would have been stark. Ice, delivered from far-off lands, stored carefully in ice houses, and used to cool drinks and preserve delicacies, was a luxury that only those with wealth and power could afford. For the majority of the population, even the idea of tasting something chilled was far beyond their reach. Historians often debate whether the use of ice in banquets was purely for enjoyment, or if it had an even deeper, more symbolic significance. Was ice used in this way simply to impress the nobility, or did it serve a more complex social purpose, reinforcing the distinctions between the classes and highlighting the excesses of royal life? It's hard to say, but it's clear that ice during these grand feasts was more than just a cooling agent. It was a statement, a visible symbol of wealth and power that stood out against the often harsh backdrop of medieval life. And it didn't stop there. Ice's role in these royal banquets wasn't confined to the dinner table. It could also be used in elaborate ice sculptures, carefully carved blocks of ice that would stand as temporary works of art during the feasts. These sculptures, sometimes taking the form of animals or intricate designs, would captivate the guests. What better way to display the king's power than by showing that he could not only command ice, but also shape it into beautiful art for his own entertainment? But there were risks involved. Ice sculptures, unlike the practical uses of ice, were fragile. The melting of the sculptures was almost expected by the end of the evening. This fragility could serve as a reminder of how fleeting royal luxury could be, how quickly even the most controlled resources could slip away. This too became a metaphor for royal life, a constantly shifting balance of power, control, and wealth, where nothing was ever truly permanent. Despite its fleeting nature, ice became a defining feature of medieval opulence. For those who could afford it, it was a cool escape from the relentless heat of summer, a symbol of wealth, and an opportunity to impress. For the king, ice served not only as a tool for cooling his body, but as a reminder of the extraordinary efforts required to maintain his position. It was his way of saying, "Look at what I control. Look at the lengths I go to in order to remain the ruler." In the end, the use of ice in medieval banquets may have been both practical and symbolic, a cool indulgence for the king, a rare privilege for the court, and a visible reminder to everyone of the king's power over the environment itself. Now that we've seen how medieval kings used ice for banquets and feasts, let's turn our attention to another curious use of ice in royal life, the king's chambers. Imagine the scene, a grand royal bedchamber dimly lit by flickering torches. The stone walls of the room hold the chill of the night air, but it's not just the natural cold of winter that keeps things cool, it's ice. Yes, ice was used in the king's very sleeping quarters to make the unbearable heat of summer more bearable. While most of us today struggle to sleep in the heat, kings were ahead of their time when it came to staying cool at night. During the summer when the temperatures soared, sleeping in a stone castle could become an uncomfortable ordeal. The thick stone walls, while excellent at keeping warmth inside during the winter, acted like a heat trap during the summer months. The rooms could become stifling, and even the grandest of palaces had limited options for cooling down. The king, needing to remain rested and composed for the next day's affairs, would rely on ice to help keep his chambers cool. It wasn't uncommon for the royal court to make use of ice in the king's sleeping quarters, especially during the hottest parts of the year. Ice was placed in basins or coolers inside the room, and sometimes ice was brought to the king's bed itself. The blocks were carefully laid out in the corners or along the walls, helping to lower the ambient temperature just enough to make the heat a bit more tolerable. The feeling of a cool breeze that came from the ice must have been a welcome relief after a long, hot day of politics and royal duties. Historians still argue about just how effective these methods of cooling were. Did the ice truly bring the temperature down enough to make a significant difference? Or was it simply a symbolic gesture, a way for the king to feel that he had control over his environment? Some suggest that the psychological effects of seeing ice in the room could have had more of an impact on the king's comfort than the ice itself. The mere sight of it, the knowledge that it was available, might have had a calming effect on the mind, helping the king to feel cooler, even if the physical effects were modest at best. But let's not discount the role that ice did play in providing physical relief. Medieval kings would often find themselves sweating through their bed sheets in the summer heat, struggling to sleep and recharge for the next day's work. A cool room, made possible by the ice, allowed the king to rest more comfortably and maintain his energy levels. The importance of rest in the medieval world cannot be overstated. After all, decisions of immense importance could be made at any time, and a king needed to stay alert and sharp at all hours. On a practical level, the use of ice in sleeping quarters represented an early form of climate control. While we take air conditioning for granted today, medieval kings had to rely on nature and ice if they wanted a cool night's sleep. And just like modern air conditioning, ice had to be maintained. Ice had a short lifespan and needed to be replenished regularly. If the ice melted too quickly or the supply ran out, the king would be left to sleep in a hot room, something that was less than ideal for his mental and physical well-being. But what if there were more to this than simply cooling down a room? What if ice had a deeper, almost therapeutic function in the king's chambers? Imagine the king, after a long day of political maneuvering and decision-making, lying back on his bed, ice placed strategically around the room. Perhaps it wasn't just about comfort, it was about recharging, both physically and mentally. The soothing effects of the cold could have helped calm a racing mind, allowing the king to sleep deeply and prepare for another demanding day. Historians still debate whether the use of ice in the king's chambers was as essential as it seemed. Was it a luxury that only the wealthiest rulers could afford, or was it a necessary tool for maintaining royal composure and health? It's likely that it served both purposes, providing physical relief from the heat, while also reinforcing the image of the king as someone who had command over his surroundings. Ice wasn't just a fleeting luxury, it was a resource that required careful planning, consistent upkeep, and a level of dedication. For a king, this was an investment in his own well-being and reputation. The act of having ice available, whether for the banquet table or his personal sleeping quarters, was an act of self-care in a time when royal duties were constant and unforgiving. In that sense, ice wasn't just about cooling down a room, it was a tool for managing stress, ensuring that the king could stay sharp and in control, no matter how heated the situation became. As we look back at these royal uses of ice, it's hard not to marvel at the ingenuity involved. While we can now press a button for cold air or a chilled drink, medieval kings had to be much more resourceful. They understood the importance of maintaining composure, and they did so with the limited resources they had at the time. Ice, which we often take for granted, was a key part of this strategy, keeping the king physically comfortable and mentally at ease during even the most turbulent times. Now that we've seen how ice was used in the king's chambers to ensure a restful night, let's turn to another fascinating aspect of medieval life: ice's role as a form of royal self-care. It might sound strange to think of ice as part of a medieval healthcare regimen, but kings, just like anyone, needed to take care of their health, especially when their decisions affected an entire kingdom. The physical and mental demands of ruling could be overwhelming, and kings relied on a variety of methods to maintain their well-being. Enter ice, not just a cooling agent, but an essential part of a royal health plan. In the medieval world, medicine was a far cry from what we know today. Without the scientific understanding of medicine and health that we now take for granted, medieval doctors often relied on a mixture of herbal remedies, superstition, and natural treatments. But one thing they did understand was the power of temperature. When someone was feeling overheated, whether from a fever, the summer sun, or the stresses of ruling, cooling the body with ice was seen as an effective way to restore balance. Imagine the king sweltering in the heat, his thoughts clouded by the weight of his responsibilities. A royal physician would come in and suggest a refreshing treatment: ice. This wasn't just about feeling cool, this was about bringing the body back into equilibrium. Ice could be used to reduce fever, calm inflammation, and even relieve the discomfort of exhaustion. For a king who could not afford to fall ill, these treatments were more than just a luxury, they were a matter of survival. Historians still debate the exact medical benefits of ice in the medieval period. Did it truly have the therapeutic effects that doctors of the time claimed? Modern science tells us that ice can reduce inflammation and help manage pain, but medieval medicine didn't have the same understanding of the body's processes. Nevertheless, it's clear that kings believed in ice's power. Whether it was used as a compress on aching limbs or placed on the forehead to cool fevered brows, ice served as an early form of self-care, a way for kings to remain sharp and healthy in a time when illness could be fatal. But it wasn't just physical ailments that ice helped with. The mental toll of ruling a kingdom was immense, and kings often faced enormous pressures to make decisions that could affect the lives of thousands. To stay mentally sharp, kings would turn to ice as a way to refresh not just their bodies, but their minds. The cooling effects of ice could help reduce stress and anxiety, allowing the king to regain focus. It's almost like the medieval equivalent of taking a mental health day, except with a few frozen blocks of nature's finest therapy. Ice was also used to treat various ailments that came with the stress of royal life. For example, the physical exhaustion of ruling could lead to conditions like migraines or body aches. Ice was often used to alleviate these symptoms, offering the king a much-needed respite from the pressures of courtly life. In an age where pain relief options were limited, ice was a natural, accessible remedy. Interestingly, this use of ice for physical and mental health was not limited to the king alone. His inner circle, the courtiers, the nobles, and even the knights, might also have had access to ice for similar purposes. The availability of ice at royal courts could serve as a status symbol, but it also reflected the importance of health and wellness among the elite. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about survival in a high-stress, often dangerous world. But not all kings had access to ice. While some had vast reserves of the precious commodity, others might have had to make do with less. This disparity added to the social divide between the elite and the common people. For peasants, ice was an impossibility, something that existed only in stories or in the distant castles of their rulers. Kings had the privilege of using ice as a form of health management, while the common folk had to rely on simpler remedies, many of which were less effective. Historians still argue about the extent to which ice was seen as a legitimate form of medical treatment in medieval times. Was it considered an effective remedy, or was it more of a placebo, something that offered the illusion of relief? One thing's for sure, it was certainly a powerful symbol. When a king used ice to treat his ailments, it wasn't just about staying cool. It was about showing that he had access to the best resources and the most advanced treatments of the time. Ice became a part of the royal narrative, a key player in the king's ongoing efforts to project strength, control, and composure. In today's world, we might reach for an over-the-counter painkiller or a modern remedy to cool down. But in the medieval period, kings relied on the simplest, most natural method at their disposal: ice. It was a luxury, yes, but also a tool that helped kings maintain their composure, stay healthy, and lead effectively. And while we might laugh at the idea of using ice as a treatment for everything from fevers to stress, it's important to remember that in the medieval world, the power of ice was undeniable. It represented not only comfort but control. Control over the environment, control over the body, and control over the mind. So, the next time you reach for a cold drink on a hot day, Think about the medieval kings who did the same, but for far more than just comfort. They used ice as a tool for their health, their power, and their leadership, something we can still learn from today. Now that we've explored ice as a tool for royal self-care, let's shift our focus to a more practical use of ice in medieval times, its role as a medicinal tool. While today we think of ice as a simple way to cool down our drinks or soothe a sore knee, for medieval kings, ice was used in a variety of medical applications, some of which might surprise you. In an era when medical knowledge was still in its infancy, kings turned to the natural world for remedies, and ice was one of their most trusted tools in the royal medicine cabinet. Medieval physicians, although often limited in their understanding of the human body, did know that cooling the body was a powerful method for treating certain ailments. One of the most common uses of ice in medieval medicine was to treat fevers. In an age where diseases like the plague and other infections were rampant, fevers were a frequent symptom and often a sign of something far more dangerous. Ice could be used to lower the body's temperature, cooling the fevered king and offering temporary relief. Imagine the king, sweating and restless in his bed, with royal physicians gently placing ice on his brow or using it as a compress to bring down his fever. The use of ice wasn't just for comfort, it was seen as a form of treatment, something that could restore balance to a body in distress. But ice wasn't only used to treat fevers, it was also recommended for a variety of other ailments, from headaches to inflammation. Kings who suffered from the physical strain of ruling, constant pressure, long hours, and sleepless nights, would often turn to ice as a remedy for the pain that came with their royal responsibilities. Imagine a medieval king, weighed down by the constant stress of his position, seeking relief in the form of a cool compress on a sore back or aching muscles. Ice, applied to the skin, was a simple yet effective way to numb pain and reduce swelling. It's a bit like the medieval equivalent of a modern-day ice pack, though with far fewer conveniences. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these medieval treatments. Were they based on sound medical principles, or were they more about the symbolism of the act? Could ice have truly had the same healing properties that we associate with it today? Or was it simply a placebo, offering relief through the power of suggestion? While modern medicine tells us that cold therapy can reduce swelling and inflammation, it's unclear whether medieval kings understood these concepts in the same way. What we do know is that ice was used extensively and often in royal medical treatments, and it was widely accepted as a necessary tool for healing. The use of ice wasn't just a royal indulgence, it was an integral part of the healing process for many medieval rulers. For kings who could not afford to fall ill, the idea of using ice to treat minor injuries or illnesses was a practical and necessary step in maintaining their health. After all, a king who couldn't stay on top of his game was a king who risked losing control of his kingdom. By incorporating ice into their medical routines, kings ensured that they could stay healthy enough to make the tough decisions that would shape the fate of their realms. But even with its benefits, ice wasn't always an easy solution. Harvesting enough ice to treat the king's ailments required significant resources. Ice had to be sourced, stored, and carefully transported, and sometimes the process wasn't always as effective as planned. Ice could melt faster than anticipated, and in a time when refrigeration was non-existent, keeping it cold for extended periods was a challenge. Imagine being a medieval physician, trying to work with a dwindling supply of ice, and the king growing increasingly restless as the discomfort of his illness grows. The pressure to make sure the ice remained intact and effective would have been immense. Despite these challenges, ice became an important part of medieval medicine. It wasn't just a luxury, it was a resource that could be used to treat a variety of conditions, from fever to muscle aches, and even to soothe the mental strain that came with the stresses of kingship. While we might not consider ice to be a groundbreaking medical discovery today, in medieval times, it was a powerful tool, a symbol of both natural healing and royal power. It's also interesting to note that ice was often used alongside other medieval remedies, which were often a curious mix of herbal concoctions, religious rituals, and superstitions. Kings would frequently rely on a combination of ice and these more traditional treatments. The royal physicians might prescribe a concoction of herbs, a prayer for divine intervention, and an ice bath to balance the humors, or restore the body's natural flow. While we may laugh at these old treatments today, they were an essential part of medieval healthcare, and for the kings who used them, they represented the best available options at the time. Historians still argue whether the use of ice was more of a symbolic gesture in the royal court, reinforcing the king's image as someone in control of both his environment and his body, or if it was truly an effective remedy. Was ice more of a status symbol than a medical treatment? Did it have real healing properties, or was it more about the mental comfort it provided to the ruler and his court? Regardless of the answer, ice was undeniably an important part of medieval royalty's healthcare practices. In the end, ice was far more than a mere commodity. It was a tool of power and prestige, and a key player in the royal medical kit. Whether it was used to cool feverish brows, soothe aching muscles, or help kings maintain their composure under pressure, ice was a valuable resource that played an integral role in medieval royal life. As we've explored, ice was not only a symbol of wealth and comfort, but also an integral part of a king's health regimen. However, beyond its practical and medicinal uses, ice also had a more intangible value in medieval courts. It became an emblem of control, status, and even diplomacy. In a world where power was often demonstrated through the ability to command resources, ice was a rare and precious luxury that could communicate the king's dominance not only over his own kingdom, but over nature itself. The use of ice as a diplomatic tool may seem strange, but it was indeed a currency of power in the royal courts. Imagine a king in the midst of negotiations with a neighboring ruler. He doesn't just offer gold or land, he offers ice. A gift of ice was not just a gesture of hospitality, but also a means of demonstrating the king's wealth, reach, and control over resources. For a king to have the ability to present such a rare commodity was to remind others of his influence and status. Ice, after all, was not readily available everywhere. The king who could procure and offer it was the king who had something to show for his power. Ice's role in diplomacy was subtle yet impactful. In the courts of the medieval world, where alliances and rivalries were often decided over meals, gifts, and feasts, the offering of ice was a statement. It signaled that the king in question had the means to cool not only the bodies of his guests, but also the temperature of the political atmosphere. What better way to show that a king was in control than by offering a resource that could bring cool relief during tense moments? Ice was, in a way, a method of soothing both body and spirit, offering a moment of calm in the midst of heated negotiations. Historians still debate whether ice was truly used as a diplomatic tool in the way we imagine today. Did kings actually give ice as gifts in high-stakes diplomacy, or was it merely a symbolic gesture that highlighted their wealth and sophistication? Some historians argue that ice, while certainly a luxurious commodity, may not have had as much of an impact on diplomacy as we think. Yet the idea of ice being used as a form of social currency is not far-fetched. Given the limited access to ice and the vast distances it had to travel to reach royal courts, the ability to offer it during important gatherings would have communicated something deeply significant. Access to resources and, by extension, a level of power that was unmatched by many other kingdoms. But beyond diplomacy, ice also played an important role in the cultural rituals of medieval kings. In the same way that a king might give an audience to foreign ambassadors or host grand feasts to entertain his court, he might also invite select nobles and courtiers to partake in the cooling comfort of ice. These moments were not just about relaxation, they were about showcasing the king's capacity for control over nature, and by extension, the court itself. When a king could offer his courtiers ice to enjoy, he wasn't just providing a refreshing break from the heat. He was reinforcing his place as a ruler who could provide comfort and luxury to those around him. At times, ice became a symbol of the king's reign itself. To have ice readily available was a reminder of the king's affluence, of his ability to not only maintain control over his immediate environment, but also to shape the world around him. Ice, in this sense, was not just a practical tool, it was a visual representation of power. It became an art form, a temporary but striking manifestation of a king's ability to bend the world to his will, even in the smallest ways. But it wasn't all smooth sailing when it came to procuring ice. The very rarity of the resource meant that kings had to rely on well-established networks of ice merchants, middlemen, and servants who could gather and transport the ice. These intricate networks, while necessary, added an element of fragility to the process. Ice was difficult to transport without it melting. This is where the true ingenuity of medieval logistics came into play. Sometimes the king's ice would arrive late, or worse, it would be of poor quality, leading to potential embarrassment. After all, a king who couldn't properly store his ice was a king who failed to demonstrate proper control over his kingdom, both literally and figuratively. The challenges of obtaining and preserving ice highlighted the lengths to which medieval royalty would go to maintain their image. Ice was not simply an indulgence, it was a way to display power, sophistication, and an unspoken message of unchallenged authority. It was the type of luxury that only the most powerful kings could afford. Those whose influence and resources stretched across vast territories, who could command both nature and people alike. In modern times, ice may seem like a trivial commodity, something we take for granted in our fridges and freezers. But back in medieval Europe, it was a rare and precious resource that was bound to the very essence of royal power. The act of acquiring, storing, and using ice was a reminder of the ways in which kings had to go to great lengths to maintain their status and control. Ice wasn't just about staying cool, it was a visual reminder of royal supremacy. Historians still argue about the symbolic power of ice in the medieval court. Was it merely a reflection of the times, where royalty was expected to display their wealth and power, or did it serve as a deeper reflection of how kings maintained control? The debate continues, but one thing is clear. Ice was far more than a commodity in medieval Europe. It was a tool for projecting power, a resource that only the most influential could wield, and a subtle symbol of control over nature and society alike. As we continue exploring the world of ice in the medieval court, let's turn our attention to one of the most fascinating and perhaps unexpected roles that ice played in the lives of medieval kings: its connection to power and authority. While ice was a practical tool for cooling off and preserving health, it also held a symbolic value that played a critical role in how a king projected his authority. The act of obtaining, storing, and displaying ice was, in many ways, a demonstration of royal power. It wasn't just a matter of personal comfort. Ice became a tool for reinforcing the king's image as someone who could command the elements, a ruler whose wealth and influence knew no bounds. Think about it. In a time when few people had the luxury of cooling down in the summer heat, the very idea of a king having access to ice was a direct reflection of his dominance. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about control. Ice, as a rare and precious commodity, became a visible indicator of a king's power. The more ice a king had access to, the more he could showcase his control over resources and nature. For a king, being able to provide ice to his courtiers and guests wasn't just about being a good host. It was a way of saying, I control not only my kingdom, but even the very air around me. It was a way of elevating himself above the common folk, demonstrating that he had command over not just his people but the environment itself. But it wasn't just about impressing guests or showing off. Ice also served as a tool for maintaining order and composure in the royal court. As we've seen, the pressures of kingship were immense. Kings had to make life-altering decisions on a regular basis, often under extreme stress. In such an environment, staying cool, literally and figuratively, was crucial. The presence of ice in the king's chambers, whether in the form of cooling drinks, ice baths, or cold compresses, helped the ruler maintain his composure, reducing the physical and mental strain of his duties. The coldness of the ice provided a literal escape from the suffocating heat of royal life, offering a brief but essential reprieve from the chaos that surrounded him. Historians still debate whether the use of ice had a direct effect on the king's ability to lead. Was ice truly a necessary tool for maintaining royal composure, or was it more of a luxury that kings indulged in for symbolic reasons? Could the calming effects of ice have helped a king think more clearly? Or was it simply a matter of status, a demonstration of wealth and sophistication? While we may never know the full answer, what's clear is that ice played a significant role in shaping how kings viewed themselves and how they were perceived by others. As the king's reputation as a composed and powerful ruler grew, so did the mystique surrounding his ability to command nature. Ice became an extension of the king's authority, not just in terms of its physical effects, but as a symbol of his control over all things. When a king was able to provide ice for his court, he wasn't just providing relief from the heat, he was reinforcing his position as a ruler who had mastered both the physical and social world. Ice, as a scarce and difficult to obtain resource, became a tool for the king to maintain a sense of power and order in a world that was often beyond his control. This symbolism of ice was not lost on the courtiers and subjects who observed the king's use of ice. For the common people, who would never have the privilege of enjoying such luxuries, the sight of the king surrounded by ice reinforced the image of a ruler who was far removed from the struggles they faced. Ice became a reminder of the vast gap between the royal class and the peasantry. In a time when wealth and power were often measured by the ability to command scarce resources, the presence of ice served as a reminder of the king's untouchable status. But while ice was a symbol of wealth and power, it also served as a more practical tool for the king's leadership. It helped the king stay calm, clear-headed, and physically refreshed, all of which were essential for making the right decisions. Without ice, the king might have been subjected to the same stresses and fatigue as any other ruler. It was the coolness of the ice that allowed him to rise above those challenges, maintaining his royal dignity and ensuring that his decisions were made with a level head. As we reflect on the role of ice in the medieval court, it's clear that this seemingly simple commodity was much more than just a tool for comfort or luxury. It became a symbol of royal power, a means of maintaining control, and a method of ensuring that the king could stay sharp and composed in a world that demanded constant attention and decision-making. Ice, in its cold, quiet way, was an indispensable resource for kings who ruled over tumultuous times, and it became a key player in the drama of medieval power dynamics. Even though ice may seem trivial to us now, in the medieval world, it represented so much more. It was a symbol of control, an emblem of status, and a practical tool for ensuring that kings remained at their best, both physically and mentally. In a time when nothing could be taken for granted, ice was a luxury that made all the difference between staying calm and being consumed by the pressures of royal life. The next time you crack open an iced drink or cool off on a hot day, remember the kings who once relied on this rare and precious resource to maintain their rule. As we've seen, ice was far more than just a way to keep cool. It was an emblem of power, a symbol of royal sophistication, and a vital tool for medieval kings to maintain their physical and mental well-being. But while the kings of the medieval world had access to such extraordinary luxuries, the practicalities of ice, its acquisition, transportation, and storage, were no small feat. These were not conveniences that came easily. They were the result of an intricate system of labor, logistics, and dedication. The process of obtaining and maintaining ice was a significant effort, and it wasn't always smooth sailing. We've already discussed the complex methods kings used to store and transport ice, but let's dive deeper into the challenges they faced in keeping this precious commodity intact. Ice, as we know today, is something we take for granted. We simply pop it into our freezers and forget about it. But in medieval times, even the act of ensuring that ice didn't melt too quickly was a massive logistical challenge. Once the ice had been harvested from frozen lakes and rivers, it was stored in specially designed ice houses. These underground vaults were insulated with layers of straw, sawdust, or peat to help keep the ice from melting as the seasons changed. Yet, even with all these efforts, ice was still a fleeting commodity. The colder months of the year were the best time to harvest it, but the ice didn't last forever. As the warmer weather arrived, the ice began to melt. The king's stores would be replenished regularly, but there were always concerns about running out at the most inconvenient times. Ice was expensive to acquire, and having enough to last through the hot summer months could be a struggle. Imagine the royal court, the king's staff rushing to replenish dwindling ice supplies just to maintain the cool, composed atmosphere that was expected of the ruler. The pressure to keep the ice intact and ready for use could be immense. In addition to the challenges of storage, transporting ice was no easy task. Medieval roads were often unpaved and rough, and moving large blocks of ice from one location to another was no small feat. Ice was carefully wrapped in insulating materials like straw and cloth to keep it from melting during transport, but sometimes the journey took days or even weeks. By the time it reached the royal palace, some of the ice would have melted, and the king's supply might have dwindled faster than expected. This was a constant problem for medieval kings who relied on ice as an essential part of their daily lives. Historians still debate whether the effort to transport and store ice was worth the trouble. Some argue that the resources devoted to keeping ice fresh could have been better spent on more pressing matters, like securing food, maintaining defenses, or building infrastructure. Others suggest that the role of ice in royal life was so significant that it was a small price to pay for the benefits it provided. After all, a king who could control the elements, even in the smallest way, projected a sense of power and authority. The effort to maintain a steady supply of ice was, in a way, an investment in the king's image. It was a luxury that, like any other royal privilege, had its costs, but the benefits were undeniable. The use of ice also highlighted the social divide between the nobility and the common folk. While kings and nobles could enjoy ice in abundance, the peasants were left to swelter in the heat without even the hope of cooling relief. Ice, like many royal luxuries, was a privilege reserved for the elite. The average person had to rely on natural remedies, such as cool streams or shaded areas, to escape the heat. For the king, however, ice represented the height of comfort and control. It was a mark of distinction that set him apart from the rest of his subjects, and it reinforced the idea of royal supremacy. The disparity between the royal class and the common people was further emphasized by the fact that the ice was often seen as a fleeting temporary luxury. Unlike modern air conditioning, which offers a continuous flow of cool air, medieval ice was a commodity that had to be carefully managed and rationed. Ice could melt quickly, leaving the king and his court scrambling to maintain the cool, controlled atmosphere they were accustomed to. This constant need to procure and store ice added an element of fragility to the king's image. It wasn't just about having access to ice. It was about maintaining the illusion of control. When the ice melted, it served as a reminder that even the most powerful rulers were at the mercy of nature's whims. In light of all these challenges, the question arises, was the effort worth it? Was the labor-intensive process of acquiring and storing ice truly justified by the benefits it provided? Historians remain divided on this issue, but one thing is clear: ice was far from a trivial commodity. For medieval kings, it represented a critical tool for maintaining their image and ensuring their ability to lead effectively. It was a resource that allowed them to stay cool under pressure, both literally and figuratively, and it reinforced their authority as rulers who could control both their bodies and their environments. Today, we might think of ice as a basic necessity, something we take for granted without thinking twice. But for the kings of the medieval world, ice was far more than a cooling agent. It was a symbol of their power, a tool for maintaining their health, and an essential part of their daily lives. Even as they faced the challenges of acquiring and storing it, they understood that the benefits of ice far outweighed the effort it took to obtain it. In the end, ice wasn't just about staying cool. As we approach the later years of medieval history, the use of ice by kings began to evolve, shifting from an essential luxury to something that was increasingly available to the broader elite. In the earlier centuries, ice was a rare commodity that kings had to work hard to acquire and maintain. However, by the 14th and 15th centuries, technological advancements and the rise of the ice trade meant that ice would no longer be restricted solely to royalty. The infrastructure that once served only the elite began to expand, bringing this cooling luxury to a larger, more affluent class. With the growth of the European ice trade, ice became less a symbol of absolute monarchic power and more a reflection of the rising mercantile class and their increasing wealth. But while kings no longer had to go to extraordinary lengths to obtain ice, they continued to use it in ways that reinforced their status as rulers, particularly in the context of diplomacy and courtly displays. Though ice became more accessible, its use in royal courts still served a symbolic purpose. a reminder that kings, as the ultimate consumers, controlled even the most fleeting elements of nature. During the Renaissance, a time when art and culture flourished across Europe, ice began to be used not only in the king's chambers, but also in elaborate courtly entertainments. Ice sculptures, for instance, became a favored artistic form during lavish banquets and celebrations. These fleeting works of art, carved from the same ice blocks that once cooled royal feasts, were displayed as both a form of entertainment and a symbol of royal grandeur. The ice, which had once been a purely functional commodity, had become something ephemeral, beautiful yet transient, much like the reign of any monarch. Imagine the king hosting a banquet in honor of a visiting foreign diplomat, the halls aglow with torchlight. On the banquet table, shimmering ice sculptures take center stage, delicate representations of mythical creatures or intricate designs, all slowly melting under the heat of the room. The king, surrounded by his court, watches as his guests admire these fragile works of art. Ice, in this context, was no longer just a commodity. It was a form of high art, a brief moment of perfection created by the hands of the finest craftsmen. These ice sculptures also played a role in the king's image as someone who could command both nature and artistry. The ability to provide such a fleeting and delicate luxury became yet another way for kings to showcase their wealth and cultural sophistication. The transience of ice, once a simple cooling tool, took on a new layer of meaning in the courtly world. It was a reminder that nothing, not even the king's opulence, lasted forever. Ice, as it slowly melted away, served as a metaphor for the fleeting nature of power and life itself. Historians still debate whether the rise of ice as a cultural and artistic commodity diluted its original status as a tool of royal power, or whether it only further emphasized the king's mastery over the elements. Some argue that as ice became more widely accessible, it lost its edge as a symbol of exclusivity. But others contend that its continued use in royal courts simply added another layer of sophistication to the already rich world of medieval and Renaissance power displays. Kings who used ice sculptures at their feasts could be seen as both patrons of the arts and masters of nature, blending luxury with creativity in a way that solidified their place in history. By the late medieval period, ice had evolved from being an exclusive luxury to a more common, though still prestigious, commodity. The king's access to ice remained a point of pride, but it was no longer quite as awe-inspiring as it had been in earlier centuries. Nevertheless, ice continued to serve as a powerful symbol of royal control, whether it was cooling the king's personal chambers or impressing guests at a grand feast. The rise of ice as a luxury item for the broader elite meant that it no longer held the same level of exclusivity it once had. The wealthy merchant class, with their growing fortunes, began to import ice from colder regions, and the infrastructure for harvesting and storing ice expanded to meet the demands of the upper classes. But even as ice became more accessible, it was still a mark of distinction for the aristocracy, who had access to ice in larger quantities. It continued to symbolize refinement, sophistication, and the ability to control nature. In the context of medieval kings, though, ice was still a necessary tool for maintaining power. Even as the availability of ice increased, its place in the king's daily routine remained a reflection of his status. Ice was used not only for comfort, but for medical and diplomatic purposes, and its symbolic power remained strong. A king who had ice on hand was not just a ruler with control over his physical environment. He was a monarch who had mastered the art of self-care, diplomacy, and public display. In the end, ice remained a key part of royal life, evolving from an exclusive privilege to a more common luxury. And even though it became more widely available, ice never lost its connection to royal power. Whether it was cooling the king's chambers, soothing his body, or impressing his court with elegant ice sculptures, ice continued to play a role in shaping the image of the king as a master of both nature and society. As we reflect on the role of ice in the medieval world, it's clear that this simple commodity had far-reaching implications for the way kings were able to project their authority. Ice, once a luxury and a tool for comfort, became a symbol of control, sophistication, and power, a reminder that in a world ruled by kings, even nature could be bent to the monarch's will. As ice became increasingly accessible to the broader elite, its importance as a symbol of royal power started to diminish, yet it continued to hold a place of prestige within the medieval courts. While kings no longer had to go to great lengths to procure ice, the traditions and rituals that surrounded its use remained significant. It was not only about cooling the king's rooms or providing relief from the oppressive summer heat. It was about how ice, in its elegance and rarity, reflected the king's ability to dominate the natural world, even in the most subtle ways. While royalty used ice for comfort and health, its role expanded into more ceremonial and social spheres. Think back to the grand feasts and banquets held in royal halls, where ice wasn't simply a refreshment, but a statement. The presentation of ice became a spectacle, an important part of courtly life. Guests arriving from across the kingdom, or even foreign dignitaries, would witness the king's lavish hospitality, with the ice symbolizing both the king's control over nature and his capacity for graciousness. The very act of offering ice at a feast elevated the event. It was as if the king were saying, "Not only can I rule the lands, but I can also control the temperature." It was a performance that spoke to the grandeur and power of the monarchy. This elaborate display of wealth and control had a political dimension as well. The king who could offer ice, whether it be in the form of cool beverages, luxurious ice sculptures, or even a well-stocked ice chest for the heat of battle, was a king who presented himself as both generous and powerful. He was not just a ruler, he was a symbol of stability and abundance. For his courtiers, ice became a metaphor for the king's ability to provide not only in terms of governance, but in the most intimate aspects of royal life. However, as the availability of ice spread to merchants and wealthy elites, its link to kingship became more diluted. Ice, once the exclusive privilege of kings, was no longer seen as a unique mark of sovereignty. The rise of the merchant class and their increasing access to ice meant that the once imposing resource was no longer restricted to the royal court. But that doesn't mean its symbolic power disappeared. Even as ice became more common, its role in the court remained vital, still used to mark royal events, lavish feasts, and political displays, but now less of a symbol of sheer power and more a symbol of refined taste and distinction. With the development of refrigeration technologies in the 19th century, ice would slowly lose its hold as a royal commodity altogether. However, in the medieval period, it represented a key part of royal life, not only physically but symbolically. Kings used it as a tool to manage their image, to preserve their health, and to reinforce their status. Whether in the form of cold drinks, ice baths, or chilled air, it played a part in ensuring that the monarch remained composed and authoritative. As we near the end of our journey through medieval history and its fascination with ice, it's important to reflect on the role this simple commodity played in shaping the medieval monarchy. Ice was never just about cooling down, it was about power. Control over nature, control over resources, and control over the public image of the monarch. Kings didn't just want to stay cool, they wanted to show the world that they could manipulate their environment to their will. They wanted to demonstrate that nothing, neither the heat of battle nor the searing summer sun, could overwhelm them. By using ice, kings showcased not just their wealth and luxury, but their dominance over the forces of nature and the elements that governed everyday life. And in the end, ice, as a commodity, became a way for the king to connect with his people, showing that while their lives might be bound to the earth and the heat of the sun, his were tethered to the heavens and the icy winds of winter. The ice in the king's court was a reminder that power had many forms, not just military or economic, but environmental as well. The king, in his wisdom, had learned to harness nature's most fleeting commodity, making it a symbol of his eternal rule. Historians still argue about the lasting impact of ice on medieval royalty, but it's clear that the symbolism of ice was not only about its practical uses, but its cultural significance. In an age where royalty was as much about perception as it was about governance, ice was a tool used to shape how the world saw the king. As a practical tool, ice helped kings endure the heat of summer and remain mentally sharp during the rigors of governance. As a symbol, it helped them assert control over both their domain and the natural world. Kings may have walked through history with swords and crowns, but it was in the cool, still presence of ice that their true power was felt. Now, as we near the end of our exploration of medieval kings and their relationship with ice, it's worth reflecting on how this once elusive luxury transformed over time. What started as a precious and rare resource for kings eventually evolved into a more common commodity, one that was available to the broader elite by the end of the medieval period. But while the king's access to ice may have become more routine, its significance did not diminish completely. In fact, its cultural importance continued to persist, albeit in different forms. The move from royal exclusivity to broader availability mirrors a shift in the very nature of monarchy during the later medieval period. Kings, once viewed as almost divine figures with dominion over the natural world, were starting to grapple with the rise of mercantile classes and the growing power of trade. As wealth was no longer the sole domain of monarchs but increasingly shared with powerful merchants and landowners, the symbolism of ice as a royal commodity began to lose some of its mystique. Ice, while still seen as a luxury, was no longer reserved exclusively for the highest echelons of society. It became a more common sign of status, enjoyed by those who could afford it but no longer able to function as a clear marker of royal power. But this democratization of ice didn't strip away its association with authority entirely. As ice became more accessible, its role in royal displays of wealth evolved. Rather than being a rare resource used only in the king's chambers, ice found its way into courtly pageantry, banquets, and public displays of opulence. In these contexts, it continued to serve as a powerful visual reminder of the wealth and sophistication that the monarch could command. For example, at grand feasts, even as the ice became more commonplace, kings still used it to impress guests, serving chilled wines, presenting intricate ice sculptures, or ensuring that even the simplest meal was enhanced by the cooling comfort of frozen blocks. It became an aesthetic tool as much as a functional one. Historians still argue about how the symbolism of ice shifted in this period. Some suggest that as the medieval king's control over his environment became less absolute, ice began to symbolize not the king's mastery over nature, but rather the growing affluence of the broader nobility. Ice may have lost some of its mystique as it spread beyond the royal court, but its role as a luxury item that required significant resources to acquire still placed it firmly in the realm of the wealthy and powerful. Kings may have no longer been the sole purveyors of ice, but they still had the resources to display it in ways that cemented their positions of dominance. By the time the early modern period arrived, kings and nobles had refined their use of ice as a symbol of prestige. Royalty used ice not only to cool their bodies, but to cool their image, whether in the form of lavish banquets, complex ice sculptures, or elaborate drinks. Ice continued to be an emblem of aristocratic refinement. The king who had access to ice was not simply a ruler of men, he was a ruler of the elements, someone who could bring comfort and luxury to his court in ways that ordinary people could only dream of. And even as ice became more common, it retained its symbolic connection to power. In an age where the line between power and perception often blurred, ice was a constant reminder of the king's place at the top of the social hierarchy. With the development of more reliable refrigeration techniques in the 19th century, ice would eventually lose its status as an exclusive royal commodity. It would become a ubiquitous part of daily life, no longer a mark of aristocratic distinction. But for the medieval king, it remained an important and often symbolic tool for maintaining both his physical and social position. The use of ice in royal courts helped reinforce the king's authority, showcasing his ability to control nature and maintain composure even in the most challenging circumstances. Ice, once rare and elusive, served as a testament to the king's wealth, wisdom, and power. In many ways, ice's role in medieval life serves as a metaphor for the changing nature of royal power itself. Just as ice was once a rare, precious resource that marked the king as all-powerful, the shift in its accessibility mirrored the broader changes in monarchy as kings navigated the challenges of a rapidly evolving world. Kings who once ruled with absolute authority now found themselves sharing power with merchants, nobles, and increasingly powerful institutions. But even as ice became more widespread, it remained tied to the idea of royal privilege. just as kings still held certain powers that set them apart from the rest of society. As you reflect on the royal use of ice, it's hard not to marvel at the ingenuity with which medieval kings adapted to their environment. Ice was, in many ways, an early form of what we now think of as modern climate control. Kings who had access to ice were using the tools available to them to maintain their power and composure. They found ways to navigate the heat, both literal and figurative, of the political landscape. Through ice, they could cool their bodies, steady their minds, and demonstrate their dominance in a world that was far less predictable than our own. Today, we take for granted the ability to keep our homes cool, whether through air conditioning or refrigeration. But in the medieval period, the ability to control the temperature of a room was a luxury that few could enjoy. For kings, ice was not just a commodity, it was a tool of power. It allowed them to remain composed, to project an image of control, and to navigate the challenges of rulership with greater ease. The use of ice in the medieval court was a reflection of the ways in which royalty would go to great lengths to maintain their image and authority, shaping their environment just as they shaped the fate of their kingdoms. As we come to the final chapter of this cool exploration of medieval kings and their relationship with ice, it's important to reflect on the lasting legacy of this simple yet powerful resource. The role that ice played in the medieval courts of Europe might seem trivial at first glance. After all, it's just frozen water, right? But when you dig deeper, you realize that ice was so much more than that. It wasn't just a luxury or a practical tool. It was a symbol of authority, wealth, and control over the natural world. It was an essential part of the monarchy's power structure, influencing everything from personal comfort to political strategy. By the end of the medieval period, ice had evolved from an exclusive royal privilege to something that was more widely available, thanks to advances in trade and transportation. But even as it became more common, it retained its symbolic significance. Kings continued to use ice to project their status, offering it at lavish banquets, using it to cool their chambers, and even commissioning ice sculptures as works of art. Ice became, in a way, a visual shorthand for royal control and sophistication, a reminder that even in the heat of battle or the swelter of summer, the king remained unruffled, composed, and in control. Even as ice became more accessible to the wealthy merchant class, it still had a mystique about it. Those who could afford it used ice to show off their sophistication, just as kings had done for centuries. But as time passed, refrigeration technologies slowly began to change the landscape. The widespread availability of ice, combined with the development of modern cooling techniques, eventually made ice a common household item. The days of ice as a royal commodity came to an end, and with it, the need for the elaborate logistics and the social prestige that had once surrounded it. Yet, in a strange way, ice's legacy lived on. Today, we rarely stop to think about how we've come to expect cool, refreshing drinks and chilled rooms. Air conditioning, refrigeration, and ice machines are so ubiquitous that we barely even notice them. But at one point in history, ice was an extraordinary luxury, one that symbolized not just the wealth of the monarch, but the way in which they exerted control over their environment. Ice allowed medieval kings to keep their composure, both physically and mentally, in the face of the incredible pressures they faced. Historians still debate the full significance of ice in royal life. Was it more about function, or was it more about symbol? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Ice helped kings maintain their health, make clear decisions, and keep cool under pressure, but it also played a significant role in maintaining their image as untouchable rulers, able to bend the forces of nature to their will. And as ice became more accessible, its role in the royal courts slowly shifted. While it no longer served as an exclusive tool for kings, it still remained a powerful symbol of wealth and control. In the end, the story of ice in medieval times is really about the ways in which kings, like all those who wield power, used what they had at their disposal to maintain control. Ice was a luxury, yes, but it was also a tool, a symbol, and a resource that helped define the royal experience. It was about more than just keeping cool. It was about staying composed in the face of uncertainty and presenting an image of calm and control to the world. So, as we close the chapter on medieval kings and their use of ice, think about how much we take for granted today. The next time you enjoy a cold drink on a hot day, or find relief in the cool air of your home, remember the kings who once had to go to extraordinary lengths to enjoy the same simple comfort. Their use of ice wasn't just about luxury, it was about power, control, and the ways in which they shaped their world. And in that sense, ice, in all its fleeting coldness, was a reminder that even in the most uncertain times, a king who stayed cool was a king who could rule. Now, as the story of medieval kings and their cool strategies fades into the background, let your mind relax and drift into the comforting knowledge that, just as ice cooled the kings of the past, so too can the peaceful rhythm of this history guide you into a restful sleep. Let the weight of the day fall away as you relax, embracing the calm that comes from understanding a world where even kings had to battle the heat of the world, and in doing so, mastered the art of staying cool.